I want you to take a moment, breathe, and realize the privilege of having time and curiosity to think about the future. Lady and gentlemen, that act alone places you in a minority of people who are not just drifting along, but intentionally reflecting on where the tides of wealth and value are carrying us. Today, we're going to step into a conversation about silver, but not in the usual way of chasing price charts or speculating on quick wins. Instead, we're going to talk about thresholds, those quiet markers in life where a small step places you into an entirely different category of participants. Think of it like crossing a river. The moment you're on the other side, even if you've only taken a few steps, your perspective shifts. You're not just someone watching from the bank anymore, you're in it. In the world of silver accumulation, most people assume that to stand out, you need a fortress vault or a bottomless wallet. They imagine that significance requires mountains of metal stacked in secrecy. But here's the truth: the bar for meaningfully positioning yourself is far lower than most realize. Ownership in this space follows the same patterns we see in wealth, nature, and power. Unevenly distributed, heavily concentrated in the hands of a few, which means the majority hold very little, and even modest steps can set you apart. Crossing that threshold of about 50 ounces is one of those quiet markers. It doesn't sound extravagant, it's not the stuff of legends, but the moment you step past it, you're no longer dabbling. You've placed yourself ahead of the majority of participants worldwide, and that's something worth pausing on, because it's not the number itself that matters. It's what the number represents. It signifies commitment, intention, and the willingness to move beyond mere conversation into action. Think of how patterns emerge in other areas of life. In business, a handful of companies dominate entire industries. In ecosystems, a small cluster of species shapes the environment for all others. In human networks, influence concentrates in a select few. Silver is no different. A relatively small minority accumulate enough to truly matter. And so, when you take that first step, when you cross into the realm of holding 50 ounces, you've shifted categories. You've stopped being a casual observer and joined a smaller circle of people who have real exposure to the unfolding story of monetary policy, industrial demand, and shifting supply chains. But here's where the reflection deepens. Reaching that threshold is not a finish line, it's simply a beginning. It's like taking your seat in a theater before the performance starts. The curtain hasn't yet lifted, but you're inside the building, ready to witness the unfolding play. Owning 50 ounces won't insulate you from shocks, crisis, or change. What it does is give you leverage, a foothold, a reason to keep learning and keep preparing, because the environment you're stepping into is not static. Policies shift, debts compound, technologies evolve, and global systems adjust under the weight of their imbalances. Silver, in particular, carries a dual identity at once, a store of value and a critical industrial commodity. That means its future will be shaped not just by financial speculation, but by the needs of solar panels, electronics, medicine, and industries not yet fully imagined. Holding even a modest amount places you in the current of those forces. So as we begin this journey, I want you to remember something simple yet powerful. Significance often begins with small but deliberate actions in wealth, in relationships, in learning. And yes, in stacking silver, it's not the grand gestures, but the steady, consistent steps that accumulate into meaningful positions. Crossing 50 ounces is less about the weight of the metal and more about the shift in mind set it represents. From here on, you're not just reacting to the world, you're participating in it differently, and that's where our exploration begins. Let's step beyond numbers and into principles so we can see not just what is, but what patterns are unfolding and how to prepare wisely for the future. When you think about the number 50, it doesn't sound dramatic. 50 ounces of silver might sit comfortably in a shoe box. It's not a king's treasure chest, and yet in the strange mathematics of wealth distribution, that modest holding places you ahead of most people who ever set foot in this market. This is the paradox. The bar for separating dabblers from participants is not as high as we imagine. In economics, as in life, resources rarely distribute evenly. Most people hover near the margins, owning little or nothing, while a minority accumulate disproportionately. This is the same principle that governs forests, where a handful of towering trees capture most of the sunlight, or in human networks, where a few voices shape the direction of millions. When you cross the line of 50, you've essentially become one of those tall trees, still young perhaps, but standing apart from the undergrowth. The significance isn't in the physical weight of the metal. It's in what it reveals about behavior. Most people talk more than they act. They say they believe in the value of precious metals. They might buy a coin here or there, often driven by excitement or fear, but they don't follow through consistently. They drift, and in that drift lies the opportunity, because when so few commit, even a modest threshold becomes a meaningful differentiator. Crossing 50 ounces says something about you. It says you've taken action with intention. You've moved from thought into preparation. You've said to yourself, I want to be positioned differently, and positioning is everything. Think of it like chess. The value isn't in the number of pieces you start with. It's in how you place them on the board. 50 ounces, when accumulated with discipline, isn't just silver in your hand. It's a statement that you are arranging your financial board for moves most people won't see coming. But with that first marker comes a subtle danger: complacency. It's easy to think, I've done it, I'm ahead, I can relax now. But thresholds are not destinations, they are invitations. The moment you cross one, you're not finished. You're simply ready for the next stage of the journey. That's true in investing, in personal growth, and in relationships. The moment you plateau, you begin to slide backward relative to the forces around you. The world doesn't stand still. Monetary policies shift like tides. Industrial demand rises in waves. Supply chains strain under pressures we don't always anticipate. Silver is pulled in both directions. Coveted as a store of value and consumed as a raw material essential to the modern world. Holding 50 ounces doesn't freeze time. It places you in motion with these forces, and being in motion requires awareness, adaptability, and the humility to recognize that the environment is always changing. That's why the first marker of intention matters less as an end point and more as a mindset shift. Once you're here, you stop asking whether silver is worth holding and start asking how it fits into a broader system. You begin to see that wealth accumulation, whether in metal, capital, or skills, isn't about a single transaction. It's about habits of consistent, disciplined positioning. So, I invite you to pause and reflect. What does crossing this first threshold mean for you personally? Perhaps it's a reminder that you've moved from talking to acting. Perhaps it's proof that preparation doesn't require generational wealth, only patience and conviction. Or perhaps it's the realization that you've joined a smaller group of people who are positioned to weather the cycles others barely recognize. Whichever way you frame it, remember this: 50 is not about metal alone. It's about building the habit of stepping over thresholds one by one until you've constructed something far more resilient than the sum of its parts. That's how true preparation begins. Reaching 150 ounces of silver changes the story entirely. At this point, you're no longer someone who stumbled into ownership by chance or picked up a handful of coins for curiosity's sake. You've crossed into a level that demands discipline. You cannot arrive here accidentally. To hold this much silver means you've allocated resources deliberately, returned to the process consistently, and withstood the temptation to drift away when other distractions pulled at your attention. And that consistency says more about your character than the metal itself, because the truth is, markets are full of noise, prices rise and fall like tides, headlines spark excitement one day and fear the next. Most people caught in the emotions of the moment buy high when enthusiasm peaks and sell low when panic takes over. They repeat that cycle endlessly, never realizing they're being ruled by reaction rather than strategy. But if you've made it to 150 ounces, it's likely you've avoided that trap. You've built quietly, perhaps even when those around you dismissed silver as outdated or irrelevant. You've acted in the silence between headlines. And that is where real positioning is created, the discipline to accumulate when others are distracted or doubtful. That's the muscle you've been strengthening without even realizing it. At this stage, something else shifts as well. Your emotional relationship to the market. When your holdings are small, every movement in price feels monumental. A dip sparks fear, a rise sparks greed, but as your position grows into something substantial, you begin to detach. You no longer hang on each tick of the market because you understand that true value unfolds over time. This detachment isn't indifference, it's resilience. You're less likely to be shaken out by volatility because you've structured yourself to withstand it. In other words, you've traded fragility for staying power. That's a powerful position to occupy, not just in silver, but in life. Think of relationships, careers, or health. Those who build steadily, even when results aren't immediately visible, are the ones who endure. They aren't dependent on short-term validation because their foundation runs deeper. And that's what 150 ounces represents. Not just more metal, but a stronger foundation for resilience. Yet with greater holdings also comes greater responsibility. At this level, it's not enough to stack and forget. You must begin to integrate silver into a broader framework of financial security. It can no longer stand in isolation. The question shifts from, do I have enough, to how does what I hold serve my larger goals? That requires thinking about diversification, adaptability, and how silver interacts with currencies, interest rates, and global dynamics. Because silver alone won't save you, no single asset can, but silver woven intelligently into a broader strategy can give you leverage others don't have. It's a tool, not a crutch, and learning to use it well is what transforms accumulation into preparedness. So reaching 150 ounces is not just a marker of wealth, it's a marker of maturity. It signals that you've moved from dabbling into intentional positioning, from reacting into preparing. And that transition, though subtle, is what sets apart those who are swept away by the tides of change from those who quietly build vessels strong enough to ride them. Remember, life doesn't reward those who chase every ripple. It rewards those who can think in terms of cycles, endure volatility, and remain committed when others falter. By crossing this threshold, you've demonstrated precisely that. And with it, you've taken another step toward becoming not just a participant, but a strategist in a world that rarely rewards the casual. Crossing into 500 ounces is different. At this point, you're no longer just a participant in the silver market. You've become structurally significant within it. This isn't about the physical weight of the metal stacked away. It's about what it reflects in you, conviction, vision, and the ability to act when most others hesitate. Few people ever arrive here because it requires more than sporadic effort. It demands consistency through uncertainty and the strength to keep building while storms pass over. Think about what this means. At smaller thresholds, ownership is a choice of perspective. You decide to see the world differently and prepare accordingly. At 500 ounces, it becomes a reality that shapes your position in that world. You're no longer reacting to the ripples of market movements. You're positioned to ride entire tides. Your holdings have reached the level where they are no longer fragile. They are resilient, and that resilience affords you something rare in today's environment. Patience. When you reach this stage, fluctuations in price don't carry the same emotional weight. A sudden drop is no longer a reason to panic. It becomes an opportunity. A surge is no longer a temptation to sell. It's simply part of the cycle you've learned to expect. You can think in decades rather than days, and in markets, just as in life, those who can extend their time horizon have a psychological edge that others can't easily replicate. But holding this much also calls you to a higher level of responsibility. With size comes exposure, and with exposure comes the need for clarity. It's not enough to accumulate and hope. You must reassess continuously what role does this position play in your broader financial system. How does it interact with your other assets, your liquidity needs, and your long-term goals? Silver at this level stops being a passive store of value and becomes an active strategic asset. Managing it well requires perspective, adaptability, and the humility to accept that cycles will not always unfold the way you expect. Here, the conversation also widens to context because a holding of this size doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists against the backdrop of strained global systems, debt loads pushing economies into uncharted territory, currency experiments testing trust in money itself, and geopolitical fractures that can alter trade, demand, and supply overnight. In such a world, tangible assets regain importance, and having already built this position means you've anticipated something most people will only recognize when it's too late. But 500 ounces is not a finish line. It's a platform, a place from which you can act, adapt, and continue to prepare. Think of it like building a sturdy ship. Now you can navigate rough seas rather than watching helplessly from the shore. Yet even the strongest ship requires a skilled captain. You must remain alert, flexible, and willing to refine your strategy as the environment shifts. The real value here is not the number of ounces itself. It's the strategic advantage it represents. It's the freedom to act from strength rather than desperation, to adapt instead of merely react. It's the quiet resilience that comes from knowing you've built something few others have the patience or foresight to achieve. And just as in nature, where only a few species dominate the ecosystem, or in economics, where a minority of players hold the majority of wealth, you've stepped into a category that carries both power and responsibility. The challenge now is to keep that edge sharp, to stay prepared, think independently, and use what you've built not only to endure whatever comes next, but to thrive within it. When we zoom out from the personal thresholds of 50, 150, or even 500 ounces, a larger truth comes into view. The distribution of silver ownership mirrors a recurring pattern we see across nearly every domain of human activity. A small minority holds the majority while the rest operate at the margins. This isn't a quirk of precious metals. It's a law of systems. Consider wealth itself. Throughout history, from ancient empires to modern economies, a minority of individuals or families controlled disproportionate shares of resources. The same principle shows up in innovation, where a handful of breakthroughs shape entire eras, and in nature, where a few species dominate ecosystems. In networks of power, influence concentrates in clusters that ripple outward. This principle has a name, the Pareto distribution, often summarized as the 8020 rule, and silver is no exception. Roughly 80% of the privately held metal resides in the hands of the top 20% of holders. What's remarkable is how consistent this pattern is across context. It's not an accident. It emerges from the way advantages compound over time. Those who begin early, act consistently, and position themselves intelligently gradually accumulate more than those who hesitate, dabble, or wait for perfect conditions. Over decades, the gap between the two groups widens until it becomes structural, entrenched, and self-reinforcing. In the world of silver, this means that the majority of participants are lightly exposed. They may own a few ounces, enough to say they've participated, but not enough to matter in the larger story. Meanwhile, the minority who accumulate steadily and intentionally end up shaping the very structure of ownership. They become the ones with leverage financially, psychologically, and strategically. What's fascinating is how invisible this can be until it's already entrenched. Most people assume that significance requires vast wealth or privileged access, but the reality is far more subtle. The concentration begins with small, deliberate steps taken long before urgency forces action. By the time the imbalance is obvious, it's too late for most to catch up. Those who acted consistently in the quiet years become the ones in control when the noisy years arrive, and that's why understanding this pattern matters. It removes the illusion of fairness that markets often project. We like to think that outcomes are evenly distributed, that everyone has the same chance to accumulate wealth or security, but the truth is systems reward persistence more than intention. They reward those who adapt, endure, and build quietly over time. In silver, as in life, the few who commit deeply reap benefits that far outstrip the shallow participation of the many. This isn't something to resent. It's something to recognize, because once you see the pattern, you gain the power to decide where you want to exist within it. Do you want to remain in the majority, lightly exposed, waiting for certainty that will never come? Or do you want to step into the minority who act early, consistently, and with conviction? The beauty of this principle is that it doesn't require luck. It doesn't require predicting the future perfectly. It requires only the courage to start, the discipline to continue, and the perspective to see beyond the short-term noise. That's what the top holders have done, often quietly, without applause. And it's what you can do too if you recognize that the imbalance will always exist and choose to position yourself on the right side of it. The lesson then is clear. You can't eliminate asymmetry. You can only decide whether to be subject to it or to benefit from it. And the moment you step into consistent action, you stop being surprised by where the leverage is and start becoming part of it. When we talk about thresholds in silver ownership, 50, 150, 500 ounces, it's tempting to imagine that these numbers reflect some perfectly measured global ranking, as if every individual holder's position were mapped neatly on a chart. But the truth is far messier. Much of the silver in circulation isn't even in the hands of individual people. A significant share is tied up in dealers' inventories, refiner stockpiles, small businesses, and institutional channels that serve industrial needs rather than personal wealth. Once you strip out those holdings, the picture shifts dramatically. The bar for being among the leading individual holders may actually be far lower than most assume. Some estimates suggest that owning even 100 ounces could place you within the top tier of personal participants worldwide. Let that sink in. What many perceive as an elite threshold might be far more accessible than it first appears. This matters because it changes the way we think about opportunity. If the true bar is lower, then more people could realistically cross it. Yet, paradoxically, few ever do. The obstacle isn't usually financial, it's psychological. People overestimate what's required. They imagine they need vaults of metal, massive resources, or some extraordinary advantage, and so they remain passive, convinced the game is out of reach. Meanwhile, those who recognize the reality quietly build positions that put them ahead of the crowd when circumstances shift. It's a reminder that the hardest barriers are often in the mind, not the market. We tell ourselves stories about what's possible, and those stories become self-fulfilling. Believing the threshold is impossibly high prevents action. Seeing that it's within reach sparks momentum. In silver, as in life, the ability to reframe the challenge often determines who moves forward and who stands still. Another layer of complexity comes from the opacity of markets themselves. We like to imagine clean transparency, but reality is layered with estimates, assumptions, and partial data. Even the best numbers about silver distribution are speculative, fragmented, and shaped by reporting gaps. But this isn't a weakness, it's a feature of real-world systems. Perfect clarity rarely exists. What matters isn't chasing an exact figure, but recognizing the dynamics at play. This is where foresight separates leaders from laggards. When information is incomplete, your edge doesn't come from precision. It comes from interpreting patterns, seeing that the true distribution may favor those who act decisively, even without full certainty, can be the difference between being positioned early and scrambling late. Those who wait for absolute proof often discover that by the time clarity arrives, opportunity has passed. Think of it like sailing. A skilled sailor doesn't wait for the perfect forecast before leaving shore. By then, the winds may have shifted. They read the clouds, the currents, the subtle signs of change, and they act with probabilities, not guarantees. Silver is no different. The point isn't to know whether the real threshold is 500 ounces or 100. The point is to understand that there is a threshold, and that crossing it, whatever the precise number, creates optionality that most people will never have. So when you reflect on your own journey, remember this: meaningful participation doesn't require certainty. It requires conviction. It requires seeing that thresholds are lower than they appear, and that acting early compounds advantages invisibly over time. Whether the true bar is inflated by institutional holdings or understated by fragmented data, the underlying truth remains. Consistent action builds resilience while hesitation leaves you dependent on forces beyond your control. In the end, the lesson is simple: don't wait for perfect knowledge, don't be paralyzed by speculation about the exact figure. See the asymmetry, recognize the opportunity, and prepare with intention. Because when scarcity or value shifts eventually force the world to pay attention, those who acted early, even on imperfect information, will find themselves standing in strength, while those who waited will be